me kind of summarize the trends and then get in for the last few minutes of the webinar to what we can do about it. There's not a lot of great news here. I wish I could give you better news. Aging campuses are driving the need to renovate and replace that 60s and 70s space, many of which of those buildings are poorly constructed. Add to the problem, you've added a lot of square footage to address increased enrollment. In some cases, across parts of the country, that enrollment's leveled off significantly. The demand for catch-up of the aging buildings and keeping up the newer buildings is relentless, and it is significant, and it's higher than the availability of capital funding. The backlogs are growing, despite the fact that capital funds in aggregate are at least at pre-recession levels. Flat operating budgets have not provided you any relief, and energy consumption, after some gains early on in this period from 2007 to 2014, leveled off, and emissions have primarily gone down as a result of fuel switching. So if things are so bad, why aren't we seeing more building failures and major facility problems? Essentially, why isn't the roof caved in? As Rick Biedenweg said back in 1985 when he wrote a piece for APA that said, you know, before the roof caves in, we need to act. And essentially, we haven't been able to keep up with many and catch up at the same time. And why hasn't the roof caved in? Well, there's a couple of important reasons. Number one, we think that campuses are at better data. They're able to manage the most critical repair risks. People are deciding what to do. Not all buildings are created equal, and so you're thinking about this in a more strategic way. You have a lot more data that we've helped provide and other that you've provided for yourself, and we've been able to really look at this and determine what are the best ways to manage the risk and where are the best places to invest money. Second, systems tend to outperform statistical targets. Work with a lot of our colleagues, do facilities conditions assessments, and we find that most of the needs are identified in the next 1 to 3 and 3 to 5 year time period. But what we find is that when we've studied life cycles, a lot of these building systems outperform their life cycles because you're pretty good at, you know, band-aiding them together and keeping them working. And so as a result, and you've also provided some lower cost repairs to the system. So rather than replace that entire HVAC system, you've replaced the fan unit, kept it running more efficiently, and bought some extra service time rather than investing in full system replacement. Third, campuses are a collection of buildings. The risks are spread out. It is not like your house where if the roof's leaking, you got to go fix it because you don't have any place else to live. If the HVAC system goes out, you've got to bring in somebody in and replace it and have a new heating system, or else you're cold in the winter and hot in the summer. Building campuses have ways of moving people around, using other classrooms, temporarily shutting down buildings, and so you don't have to fix everything all at once. And people diversify that risk over a portfolio of buildings and have been doing it pretty successfully. Finally, functional obsolescence of space drives investments, and in many cases brings outside resources. Grants and other funding comes to deal with the space and gives the ability of institutions to move more money towards the facilities departments to move more money to envelope and mechanical and infrastructure investments. And so some of those space investments we're seeing are actually coming from sources other than the institutional or state capital program. They're coming as a result of grants that your departments are getting from, say, research grants. So one of the other things that we're seeing is that in order to be successful, people are making the problem smaller. I think for a long time, people said, we need to have a big number here for the backlog and deferred maintenance because then everybody will take notice. What we're actually finding in our work with campuses is that when the big number is put in front of the board or put in front of the state legislature, they tend to freeze. It prevents action rather than encourages action. And one of the ways that we're seeing that the people are successful in getting additional resources and focusing additional resources are by rethinking the problem and trying to make the problem divided into smaller pieces. One, by understanding that not all buildings are created equal, and so they shouldn't be treated that way. We're going to invest in some buildings and not in others. It's okay to have a set of, say, so-called transitional buildings that we know at some point we're going to knock those buildings down, and we're just not going to put any money into it. No matter what the occupants say and want, we're going to realize that if that building's going away in the next 2 to 3 years, we're not going to put any money in it right now. Second, people are breaking their campus into portfolios of work, sort of using the idea of investment portfolios to say, we're going to put money in certain places and more money in certain types of facilities than in other types of facilities, and doing that in both the capital decisions and operational decisions to kind of make the problem smaller. Third, people are dividing their capital projects by issues of reliability, safety code, program, and asset preservation, and setting priorities within those, particularly reliability projects, which means that a building that has high reliable projects and that are problems with the reliability of the building systems, there's imminent failure. And so being able to understand those key issues, what's the most important, what's critical, what could really essentially result in the roof caving in or systems collapsing, we're going to go do those first. And people have created some balance and diversity in the facilities investment with the idea that we're going to lower risks. We're going to try to lower the risk of that over 50 space becoming more and more problematic, that 25 to 50 being more and more problematic, and that younger space keeping it up so that those life cycles don't go past due. One of the other things that we're finding is that, and for those of you who remember the Rolling Stones 1966 song called Time Is on Our Side, yes it is. That in fact, we've learned over the past 30 years that you can buy time. You can fix components rather than replacing entire systems. You can understand that life cycles are inherently conservative, and therefore you may have more time than you think. You can coordinate campus needs and projects to lower the cost so that when you're hiring contractors to renovate one building and you've got electrical contractors on campus, you can do some of those other key electrical projects in other buildings. And the functional obsolescence of space will buy time by bringing in resources from other sources to address some of the repair needs of space. And so there's no reason to believe this is going to change, that steady investment over time is the way to go here. And as a result of what we're seeing and the trends, particularly in the growth of annual stewardship, where campuses are putting more and more of their own resources into capital investment and saying, we've got to have reliable funding source year after year, and we're going to chip away at this problem over time, and over the next 10 years, a multi-year capital plan is going to make a difference. They're manipulating time and money as two key variables. And finally, you're going to have to make the case for resources. I wish I could tell you that all this will go away with just a little bit of money, but the fact is that ultimately you're going to have to make the case for resources. But the people who we're finding, the campuses where facilities and finance are making a successful case for resources, are the campuses where they are showing to the board, the president, in the case of public sector, to the government leaders, that you are controlling the things that you can control. That the old approach of just making the problem bigger and saying, please help us and bail us out, is not going to happen. The problem is just too big. When you start getting into billions of dollars worth of money, people just glaze over and don't know how to address it. And so part of the responsibility of the facilities folks is to do better space management to lower the demand, make the problem smaller using building portfolio management, sustain the impact of finite funding through multi-year plans, and be able to mitigate risk by targeting that capital with critical reliability, safety code, and some asset preservation issues. By applying these actions, people have been successful in making the case for additional funding and have actually reduced the cost of operations and overhead and used those savings to self-fund that stewardship over time. Take a look, though. Those four areas all relate to that general idea of using space, capital, and operations. Understanding, communicating that all building needs are not all building needs are created equal. Using that portfolio kind of approach to break the campus into pieces, investing over time, and when you are able to have savings, reallocate those to support the capital budget, Those are the kind of things that make a difference in terms of being able to be successful in dealing with all three of those. The people who are successful in this era are people who are able to work on all three of these fronts, not just one of them. With that, Eric, I want to see if there's any more questions. We've got about 5 minutes before the end of our webinar, and I'll be glad to answer them.
Yeah, we have a couple of questions here. One from an attendee who very complimentary of today's presentation. They're wondering, have we looked at Canadian institutions? Do you know if there are any notable differences in any of these trends and issues?
Yes, of course, we just finished a study of 51 Canadian universities, and that study showed us a number of things. One, that the deferred maintenance problem is pretty similar to what we're seeing across U.S. campuses, maybe someplace between our private number and our public number. Some of the Canadian campuses, while they have many old buildings, did have some earlier renovations and earlier new space renovations done on some of the older buildings, and so they've been able to reset the clock. But the big difference I think we're seeing on the Canadian campuses is higher density. There are just many, many more students on Canadian campuses than we see on U.S. campuses. Part of that is for the square footage. Part of that is that Canadian campuses tend to be less residential, tend to have less athletic facilities, tend to have less of the recreational and other types of facilities. That could change in the future, but right now it's not unusual to see a 4 to 5 million square foot campus in Canada that has 25 to 30,000 students. While in the U.S. you would tend to have more like 15 to 20,000 students on a campus that size. So you know, you just have just a lot more people on your space. It lowers your facilities overhead, but the problem is that you're grinding those buildings down because you're using them day and night over and over again, and as a result, the deterioration rate that we're seeing on Canadian campuses tends to be faster than what we're seeing on U.S. campuses.
Thanks, Jim. Another question here. Can you expand on the idea of functional obsolescence of space that can bring capital resources to allocate for repairs? What do you mean by that?
Well, we're starting to see campuses, some cases campuses going to some kind of cost allocations process, chargebacks to cost recovery kind of approach to go back to departments, and basically saying to departments, are you generating any kind of revenue that can either go to the capital part of the space of investing in space or the operations aspect of investing in space. And so trying to get the departments and their own ability to generate revenue to be able to deal with the space renovations that they want to have, faculty offices upgrades, classroom upgrades, not the core buildings on campus, but you know, the space, not necessarily the mechanical and structural issues, but the space issues. So the idea of functional obsolescence is that, you know, you'll change space before it wears out. There are very few, there are some, but there are very few classrooms across U.S. college campuses and even Canada college campuses that look like the classrooms will look like they did 30, 40 years ago. People upgrade classrooms to respond to changes in teaching and changes in technology, and they will tend to continue to do that and change out those spaces faster than they wear out. So we're seeing campuses that are doing this strategically and being successful, asking more of the departments to lift some of this capital investment.
Thanks, Jim. One last question. With enrollment reducing and overabundance of space, have you seen decommissioning of buildings? If so, are there any trends?
Yes. We just had a presentation from Tony Calcato, who's head of facilities at Rutgers, and said that demolition is my favorite word. We're seeing on a number of campuses people just saying that, you know, we need to divest from the buildings that are those 50s and 60s buildings that are not in good shape, that are falling apart. We'll either eliminate them and live without that square footage, or we will attack those buildings by going through renovation for replacement. We have 2 states that are really active in this. Pennsylvania, the Pennsylvania State System of Higher Education has gone through a significant change as a result of renovation for replacement. You knock a building down, there's state funding available to build a new building in its place. And the state of Maine. The Maine system has also, we cite this in both of these examples in our State of Facilities paper, where the state of Maine, because of significant declining enrollment, has decided to go on a program to reduce their total square footage across their 7 campuses by 10% by eliminating the lowest use poor buildings that are in poorest conditions, that are non-historic buildings, but really attacking some of those poor condition buildings that aren't being used and saying we're going to have to learn to live without it. So I think this is a growing trend. We've got a number of campuses that have either implemented or are considering implementing a no net new space policy. And so I think it's important for people to be thinking more and more about the idea that one way of eliminating deferred maintenance is to eliminate the building. Now, you also eliminate that square footage, and the question is whether you can live without it, but I think it's becoming more and more of a trend. Any other questions?
No other questions at this time. Thank you, Jim. So that wraps up today's session. We're actually out of time, but if you have any additional questions, please feel free to continue submitting those now. While we wait for those few questions to trickle in, I'd like to let you all know that you will be receiving a post-webinar survey at the conclusion of today's session. The survey is designed to not only get your thoughts on the content of today's presentation, but to also get a sense for the challenges that you face on campus, and with those in mind, what topics you'd like to hear from Sightlines at future events. I'd also like to make sure that I encourage you all to visit the Sightlines website and our Insights page if you'd like to stay current with these trends and any of the latest best practices or innovative facility solutions that we share. Insights is your resource to easily access industry knowledge from both Sightlines and our member institutions. There you'll find blog posts, articles, webinar recordings where this session will be located, and any more information on upcoming events. You also have the opportunity to sign up for our monthly newsletter there as well. So please be sure to check that out from time to time as we frequently update this page with new information.